In the last lecture, we improved the user experience by taking advantage of the form state handled by Angular. Now let's improve this even more, and let's say we want to output some help text below this input to assist if there is an invalid value in there. Now we can use a bootstrap class here, help block, to make sure that this has the appropriate styling, and then we could say please enter a valid email. We only want to show this if if an invalid value has been entered into the control associated with this input though. Well, a quick and easy way of getting access to the control created by Angular automatically as we added ngModel to the input is by adding a local reference to this input element here, for example email, any name you like, and associating this now not with ngForm as we did for the overall form, but with ngModel. So just like the form directive automatically added by Angular when it detects a form element, the ngModel directive here also kind of exposes some additional information about the control it creates for us on the overarching form by accessing ngModel. So with this, we could simply check or say that we want to attach this span here if email is not valid, so add an exclamation mark at the beginning. Now with this, if this reloads, you see that help text, and of course you can improve this by also chaining another condition that email should have been touched to give the user a chance of changing it. So now you don't see the warning, but if you click in there and click out of there and it is invalid, you see that warning, and if you now enter valid data, it disappears. So this is another way of taking advantage of the state managed by Angular, but this also shows you how you can get a quick and easy access to control added by Angular. And with that, you should have the tools to really provide a pleasant user experience, showing the right errors, the right warnings, and styling the form correctly depending on the state of the form. Thus far, we learned a lot about the template-driven approach and how we can create great forms with it. Now let's move on, let's leave the world of validating user input here. And let's say we want to define some default values which should be displayed. For example, on the drop-down here. Right now it's empty by default. Well, it would be nice if one of the two questions would be selected, right? For this, we can change the way we add ngModel. Right now we add it like this, without property or event binding, no two-way data binding. Well, we can use it together with property binding. So let's add some squared brackets around it, no parentheses, so we're not using two-way binding as of now. And now we can bind it to a value. And remember, with it, I mean the control, this input here, which is turned into a control by Angular in the background. So this select here can now be bound to a default value. And you could either hard code a string into there, don't forget the single quotation marks in this case, or you set up a property like, let's say, default question, which would be pet. Pet, because that is one of the two valid values, the other one being teacher for this question here. So now we can bind this to default question. And if we now save this and let it reload, you see that now pet is selected. And of course, if we switch this to teacher, well, it shouldn't be a surprise that the other value is selected. So now all of a sudden we're using a default value. And of course, this does not only work for the dropdown, it would also work for the username. You could point to a default string there, pre-populating this field with a default username. Very useful and something you should definitely keep in mind, that you are not limited to using ngModel without any bindings. You can use one-way binding, property binding, to set a default value. Of course, this value can still be overwritten. You can still pick a different option here. Sometimes you not only want to pre-populate the default the user entered, but you also want to instantly react to any changes. Right now, everything about this form here only updates once I click submit. Then I get this form object where I can retrieve the value. We don't use two-way binding. ng-model is either used without any binding or with one-way binding. But sometimes you instantly want to check something or simply repeat whatever the user entered. Let's show an example. For this question here, I'm going to add a new form group, bootstrap style here, below the dropdown. I want to have a text area, let's say, to also introduce a new input. Let's name it question answer. Don't need the ID here, don't need columns. I want to have 3 rows, let's say, and I'll also distribute this over multiple lines. And now we could add ng-model to get access to whatever the user entered as a reply. But maybe, for some reason, we instantly want to repeat this reply. So below this, we could say your reply, and now we want to output the answer to the question. Well, for this, we could still use two-way binding on ng-model here and bind it to the answer property here. Of course, we need to introduce this answer property then there. An answer could be an empty string by default. With this in place, let me also add a CSS class to the text area, form control, to give it some nice styling. If this reloads, we see our text area here. And if I enter valid data here for my first pet, let's say, a rabbit named Nelly, you instantly see that here. So you can still use two-way binding. And actually, if I submit the whole form and open up the developer tools, you see in the value object, this is still part of this value object. It just is updated with every keystroke. But of course, if we submit it, we will get a snapshot of the value at a point of time we hit submit. So two-way binding is still possible. You can still use ng-model with two-way binding. And with that, you saw all 3 forms. No binding to just tell Angular that an input is a control. One-way binding to give that control a default value. And two-way binding to instantly output it or do whatever you want to do with that value. Our form has evolved quite a bit. Now let's say that on the value object we get when we submit the form, we want to group some things. For example, we want to group the secret and the question answer and the username and email to just have some structure in our object, because for a very big form, we might want to have such a structure. This would also be nice if we could then validate the validity, the status of our individual groups of inputs. Turns out that's easy to do with the template-driven approach. Here on our first group, username and email, I already have a wrapping div with the ID user data here. Now you can simply place another directive on it, the ng-model group directive, like this. And this will now group this into, well, you guessed it, a group of inputs. However, ng-model group needs to be set equal to a string. So for example, user data. This will be the key name for this group. So now if I save this with ng-model group added, if I enter value here and hit submit, and we have a look at the value of the form, you now see that we have a user data field here, which holds another object where we now have email and username. Now, not only did we add this extra field in our value, we also now have a different setup here in controls. Here we also now have a user data control with all the properties you know on those controls, like valid and so on. So if we now simply inspect our HTML code and this div with the ID user data, you see that there also we got the ng-dirty, touched and valid classes added. So you can now also check the validity of this overall code control here, for example, which might be a nice feature in your form. You can also get access to the JavaScript representation by again adding a local reference to the element which holds the ng-model group directive. Here, for example, user data would be a fitting name. And then setting this equal to ng-model group. So just like we did before with email, which was equal to ngModel, I'm now setting this reference equal to ngModel group to get access to this JavaScript object. And this would allow us to, for example, output a message if this whole group is not valid. So we could simply output a paragraph here, user data is invalid, which we add if user data, this is the local reference created here, if user data is not valid. And let's say it has been touched. So user data touched is true. With that, if this reloads, you see that we don't see any message, but as soon as I click into one of the fields and then leave it, you see user data is invalid was shown. So now you really got a very fine-grained control over your form with all these tools. We're nearing the end of the first part of this section, the template-driven approach. There's still some things I want to show you. For example, how to work with radio buttons. We don't have any radio buttons in our form as of now, so let's add some. Let's add a property in the app component first with some genders. So this is simply an array where I have male and female, and I don't want to insult anyone. I know there are more genders nowadays. I'm going to go with the classic approach here, just to keep it simple. We have this genders array, and now with that array, I want to output genders here. So let's say below our your reply paragraph here, I'll add a new div with a class of radio. And this div should be replicated for all the genders. So I'm going to loop through my genders, maybe bind it to a gender variable. And this is just a setup Bootstrap uses to give this some nice styling. Of course, use any other setup to style your radio buttons here. I'm looping through all the genders. And now again, in the Bootstrap world, to create a nice looking radio button, I'm going to wrap it in a label, this input here, which is of type radio. And I'm going to wrap this over multiple lines too, just to make it all super simple to read and to understand. And here I will give it a name of gender, because on a radio button I can only select one of them in a group. So the name should be gender for whichever button is selected. And I will place ngModel on it to make it a control. And I will pre-populate, or I will set the value of this button equal to gender. So this variable of my ng for loop. Now with that, if we save this, we should see that we have some gender buttons. To output a text, I need to add it here after my input. So again, gender here, like that. And now we have male and female here. And if I just enter something so that I can submit the form, and I pick male here, you will see that on the value object here, we got gender, which is male. And of course, if I pick female, this will, you guessed it, be set to female. So this is how you can easily incorporate radio buttons by binding or by placing ngModel on the input as always, setting the value. Of course, you could also hard code the value, and that, well, makes it usable just like any other input. And if you want to set it to a default gender, of course, you can use one-way binding again to make sure that one of the two buttons is selected by default at the start when you load the form. You can also, of course, add the required directive or attribute to that input here to make sure that now the form will not be valid until one of the two has been selected. So that works just like on any other input. So I just wanted to highlight this because radio buttons can look like a very special case. They aren't. They are used like any other input when using the template-driven approach in your Angular app. We learned a lot about the template-driven approach. Before concluding this first part of the module, let's have a look at this suggestion username button here. It doesn't work, but I added this suggest username method here, where I create a default username. Now it would be nice that upon clicking this button, we populate this username input here with this username. Now you could think about some solutions using two-way data binding, and they would probably work. You could two-way data bind this to a username property, which you then change with this method. I just want to show you a different approach. Remember that we do have access to this form here through view child. Of course, it would be nice if we could set the value of one of our inputs. And turns out we can. For this, we got two different methods we can use. The first one would be on our sign up form, the set value property method here. This allows you to set the value of the whole form. And here we need to pass a JavaScript object exactly representing our form. So we would need to use or set up user data, which is our object 2, where we have, let's check, a username field, username set to the suggested name here, and then also email set to maybe an empty string, and secret set to pet maybe, and question answer. Keep in mind, this is this text area here. So question answer set to an empty string. And last but not least, the gender set to male. And with this all added, let's go to our template and hook up this button here, which is of type button so that it doesn't submit the form. And here I'll add a click listener and target the suggest username method. So if this now recompiles and we hit this button, you see super user was entered here. However, this approach does have one downside. If we already had some value entered there and then wanted to click suggest a username, it, well, overwrites all our other content. So this is not necessarily the best approach. However, it does show you how you can set the values of all controls with one convenient command, with the set value command, where you pass an exact copy of the form value, I should say, as a JavaScript object, and can override the value of each control. Now, as mentioned, this is not the best approach, so let's comment it out. The better approach here would be to access the sign up form and now actually the form object on it, because sign up form, this overall ng form object, is kind of the container of your form, you could say. And there you also have the patch value method. So this is not available on the sign up form itself, but on the form group wrapped inside of it. And here you can pass a JavaScript object too, where you only override specific, certain controls. So here you could also pass user data. Let me restructure this so that it's easier to read. User data, and then inside of user data, here you might want to override the username, set it to the suggested name, but don't override any other value. So with this in place, if I now save this and I already have an email address entered and something here, and I click this button, now it only added super user and left all my other controls untouched. So set value and patch value, important patch value only available on the form wrapped by ng form itself. As a side note, set value would be available here too. So these two commands are very helpful. Set value to set your whole form, patch value to override parts of the form. Very useful helper methods I wanted to bring to your attention. Now we're almost done. Let's finish up our form here. We got a submit button and right now we only log it. Now let's add something to our little form here. Let's add a horizontal line below it. And let's summarize our data, maybe in a new bootstrap row here. So let's add a row class and then a column class here, a very simple one. Let's summarize our data there. I'll place the horizontal line between the bootstrap rows. And I want to say or output my username here. I want to output my mail address, maybe my secret question and my answer to that question, as well as my gender. So just a nice summary. I only want to output this once the form has been submitted and then populate it with the data of my submitted form. So in the add app component here, I could add a new property named user maybe, which is a JavaScript object, which holds a username property. Let's set it to an empty string by default, an email property, and these names here, of course, don't have to match the control names in your form. That's a brand new JavaScript object, not related to your form directly at least. Then here we might also have a secret question, which is a string, and then we have the answer, which is a string, and finally the gender, which is a string. So that's my user object as created by default. And when submitting the form, I want to update it. So here I want to say this user, and there I want to access the username, let's say, and set this equal to my sign up form, access the value of this form, and there we know we have a username input field like this, and replicate this now also for the email. And of course, the value, of course, was available on the user data grouping though. So username and email was in the user data model group. Keep this in mind. So we have to access this model group property first before we can access the final username and email. However, the secret question here was available like this. We did name the control secret though. So make sure to use secret here when accessing it in the form value. And the answer, well, let's see which name we gave this. We gave it the name question answer. So let's use this when accessing the form. And finally, we want to set the user gender equal to what we stored in the sign-up form. Here, we did name this control gender too. You can check it down there, gender. So with that, we now update all that information in our user. Maybe we also want to track whether we did submit the form. So we do have a submitted property set to false initially, and we set this to true here because, well, guess what? We submitted the form. And with that, we could place ngIf on our row here to check whether the form was submitted. And only if it was submitted, I want to display this block. And here, I then want to output user, username, and of course all the other information we gathered, like user email here. So let's quickly add all of this. Here the question would be your first, and then we store user secret question. Here we have the answer, and so on. Of course, structure this in whatever way you want to structure it. I just want to show you how you can access your values and use them. And with this all in place, now you don't see that section by default, but if I enter something here like Anna, or let's suggest a username actually, my email address, my first pet, which is Nelly, and then the gender, I think that surprises you. That's not correct though. So let's hit submit, and now we see the data here at the bottom. This is how you can extract the data, how you can use it, how you can add a property like submitted to make sure you only display certain sections if the form was submitted, and how you in the end use that data. One more thing before we move on to reactive forms though. In the last lecture, we saw how we can finally submit the form, extract the data we want to extract, just so that you saw this too, that you just can access the value property on your form. Now let's say we did extract all the data, and now we want to reset the form. Well, turns out this is super simple. On our form, sign up form in this case, which again is just fetched directly from our template with viewChild. On this form, we can call reset like this. And this will reset the form. And what this means is it will not only empty all the inputs, you could do this with set value too, as you learned. It will also reset the state, like the valid, the touched, and so on, these properties. So now if I enter something here again, like this, and I hit submit, you see everything is empty, and if we inspect it, you see that also the classes have been reset to pristine, invalid, and so on. So it's really like the page was loaded again. Very helpful to notice how to reset the forms. With that, you got a great overview over how you can quickly create powerful forms with Angular, with the template-driven approach. This approach might be well suited for the majority of your use cases. During the rest of the module, though, we're going to have a look at the other approach, the reactive approach, which gives us even more control over our forms and which allows you to create more powerful forms, your own validators, and much more. So let's dive into this in the next lectures. So, time to practice the things you learned about the template-driven approach in the last lectures. Here's your assignment. I want you to build a form which has a mail address input field, a drop-down with 3 options, basic, advanced, and pro, a password field, and a submit button in the end. I also want you to add some validators to these fields. The email should not be empty and it should be a valid email address. For the drop-down, there is no validator, but I want you to select a default or to set a default right from the start, the advanced option. And for the password field, it should not be empty. And once you created that form and added the validators, I want you to take advantage of the form status by displaying a message if the form is invalid and has been touched, or if a single element is invalid and has been touched. And once you submit the form, I simply want you to print the value to the console, though of course feel free to go for a more advanced solution where you output the values in the template. This is the assignment. Have fun with it. In the next video, we're going to have a look at my solution. So, were you successful? Let's solve it together. I will leave the instructions here at the top so that we can have a look at them. And I will start with the form element. Remove the action, of course, because we don't want to send a request. Instead, Angular should take over. And it already takes over because it detects the form element here. Now in this form element, I'll add a form group, a div with a CSS class of form group, and this is a pure styling thing. Has nothing to do with Angular forms. It's just to make it look nice. In there, for the mail address, I'm going to add a label for an element with the ID email. Let's name it mail. And let's add the appropriate input below it. Type email maybe. Set the ID email. And now, to register it as a control in our Angular form, we have to add ngModel. Remember, this is how we tell Angular that this input now actually is an active control of this form Angular created automatically. For ngModel to work, you need to make sure that you added here an app module in the imports array. So with this added, we also need to add a name here. The name should be email because it makes sense, I guess. It is an email address we want the user to enter here. And I'm going to distribute this over multiple lines. Now, this should also receive 2 validators. It should not be empty, and it should be a valid email address. So let's add required, this HTML attribute, which will be taken over by Angular so that Angular now checks the validity. And then the built-in validator Angular offers email to check whether this is a valid email address or not. With that, we're almost done. The last thing I want to add here is I want to add a CSS class, form control, to make it look nice. Again, this is a bootstrap class, has nothing to do with Angular forms. With that, I'll move on to the next control. I'll also place this in a div with a form group CSS class to make it look nice. And in here, we want to create a drop-down to allow the user to choose a subscription. So I'll add a label for, well, let's name it, give it an ID of subscription. And here we could say choose a subscription, something like this. And then a drop-down is created with a select element here. Now the name could be subscription because it makes sense. The ID should be subscription to match this label. And I will also add ngModel here. And we already have the name, so no need to add this again, but we need to add a class, form control. We don't need to add it, but again, I want to have this look all right. With this, the select is configured. Now we need to add the options. And we could hard code the options in here, but just to show an alternative, and this is purely optional, I'll go into my app component, and here I will add a subscriptions array as a property. And here I simply want to add basic, advanced, and pro as free strings in this array. And with that, I can now go back to the template, add the option, but not fill it manually. But instead, I will simply add an ng for loop to loop through all these subscriptions I set up. So let subscription of subscriptions. And this allows me to bind value here via property binding to, whoops, not like this though, like this, to the subscription of the current iteration. And then we can, of course, output it here too to give the user something to see as well. And with this, if we save, just to check if we're on the right path, I already got ngserve running. That looks all right. Now with this, we need to set a default value here though. And one way to do this, a nice way actually, is to create a property, for example, the selected subscription we could call it, and set this equal to advanced. Should of course be a value of our array here. So we can use this selected subscription property here to set the default value by using one-way binding, property binding on ng model. So I'm going to distribute this over multiple lines as well. And now ng model with squared brackets, to again set up property binding, should be bound to the selected subscription, to the property we just created in the TypeScript code. With this, if we now save this and have a look at it again, we should see that advanced is now the default option because we're setting a default value. Keep in mind, if we now change the selected value, this will not update selected subscription here because we set up property binding, one-way binding, not two-way binding. It's not updating the property is only setting the value of our dropdown. That's important to keep in mind. Now, the last field to add here is the password field. So let's quickly do this. Just add another form group maybe. And in there, I'll add a label for the password, say password here, and add an input, which should be of type password to hide the characters, which should maybe have an ID of password to match the label, and a name of password because it makes sense, I guess. And of course, very important, add ng model to register it as a control in our form. Now with this, we created this as well, and here we should add the required validator because again, this is what we expect here. The password field should not be empty. I'll also add the CSS class form control to improve the styling. Again, this has nothing to do with Angular though. This is purely optional to make it look nicer. With this, our form is almost complete. I'm now going to add a button here at the bottom with two bootstrap classes, button and button primary. I'll say submit on this button and I'll set it of type submit. This is technically not required since the only button in a form will automatically submit it, but just to have semantically correct HTML code, this button will submit the form, so we should set it of type submit. With this, if we now have a look at our finished form here, looks all right. Let's check if the validation works. If I check my mail address, it's invalid. If I enter a valid email address, it's valid. If I remove the @ sign, it's invalid. So this looks all right. The subscription doesn't have any validation. Now for the password, it's invalid. It should change as soon as I type one character, and it does. So this is all valid. Let's now make this form submittable, or actually, let's first work on these warning messages. I want to display warning messages for my mail and my password input because these are the two inputs which have validators. So in the form group of the email, below the input, I'll add a span, and on the span I'll add the class help block. Again, this is bootstrap styling to make it look nice. Of course, you can use any other CSS framework or your own CSS code. And in here I will say, please enter a valid email. Now it would be nice to not always see this message, but only if the mail input is invalid and was touched to give the user a chance of actually changing it before we show an error. Well, therefore, what I can do here is I can add a local reference, email, and bind it to ng-model as we learned it to get access to this control Angular creates for us on the form. Now with that, I can add ngIf here and say if not email is valid, so if it is invalid, I want to show this, but also email should have been touched. So if these two conditions are true, I want to show my help text, and the check, which we do now, should show that it works. If I click in there and click out of there, we see the warning. If I now enter a valid email address, it's gone. So this works. Now let's also copy this and add it for the password here in the form group as well. Here I will say, please enter a valid password and adjust my code to place a local reference on the password field. Maybe give it a name of password and bind to ng-model again to get access to this control which was created. And then I'm going to replace email here in the ngIf condition with password. And now we should get the same behavior down there. If I click in there and click out of there, we see the warning. If I enter something valid, it's gone. If I remove that, we see the warning again. So this is working. Let's now add a message for the whole form. For this, right above the button, maybe I'll add a paragraph where I will simply say the form is invalid. Any message you like, of course. And now I want to get access to the form. So I will place a local reference on this overall form element, because this is how we can learn that we can get access to the form Angular created for us. Give it a name, F or form or whatever you like. I'll name it sign up form and set this equal to now ng form, not ng model, because we're not talking about a control here, but about the whole form. And there it is, ng form. And with that, we can use it down here or anywhere in our template actually to check whether the sign up form is valid. If it is not valid, so with an exclamation mark at the beginning, and if it has been touched, then I want to show the form is invalid. So if I click in here, click out of there, we see the form is invalid. Let's enter something in both fields. It's gone. Last step is submitting the form. To submit the form, we have to hook up the submit button. And remember, you don't add a click listener to the button. Instead, you take advantage of the default behavior of HTML and add the ng submit event here. Now here we can execute on submit or any method name you like and add this method in the component on submit like this. Add it here. And now you could either pass the form as an argument to this form, to this method, excuse me. So simply pass it here, the sign up form, and then receive it as an argument would be perfectly fine. Or you use add view child to get access. So that is what I'll do here. I'll use add view child, which needs to be imported from add Angular core. Select my sign up form, so this local reference name you created. Give it any name you like here. This does not have to match the name you chose in the template. So this could just be the SGN form, just to show that it may be different. This will be of type ng form then. Make sure to import this type from add Angular forms. With this, we now got access to the form in our template. So here, in our TypeScript code. So here we can now access it like this and output the value of our form once we submit it. So let's see this in action. Let's head over to our form, enter some valid values here like this, open a console and hit submit. And this looks all right to me. We got an object with our free controls and the values we did enter. So this was a tiny little exercise about the things you learned in the last lectures. Let's now move on to the reactive approach. In the last lectures of this module, we learned a lot about Angular forms and how we can create such a form and configure it to our needs. But remember, there were two approaches, not just one. So we had a look at the template-driven approach. Now we're going to have a look at the reactive approach. This approach allows you to configure your form in greater detail. You create the form programmatically in TypeScript, and whilst this might sound more complicated, It actually isn't that difficult, and it might be what you need for your new project. So let's dive into this approach now. Just like before, I already created a little template, a little HTML code for the form with which we're going to work. It looks like this, and you can find it attached to this video. Now, as I said, in the reactive approach, the form is created programmatically, so in TypeScript code. So this is where we should start working on it in this app component here, in this TypeScript file. Here, I want to create a new property which will hold my form in the end. And no worries, programmatically doesn't mean from scratch. Angular offers us a lot of tools to quickly create such a form. So I want to store it in a property which you may give any name you like. I'll name it sign up form. And important, this will be of type form group. Now I could auto import it, but since it's important to understand, I'm going to import it manually this time. Form group needs to be imported from @Angular forms. This is the forms package, as the name says, and it contains a lot of classes we will work with. In the template-driven approach, we already imported ngForm from it. Now, ngForm was this automatically created wrapper, you could say. But it was wrapping a form group in the end, because in Angular, a form in the end is just a group of controls. And this is what a form group holds. Therefore, the overall form also is just a form group. Now this is all. We don't need to set an initial value for now. This gives us a property with which we can work, which will hold our form in the end. Now important, for the reactive approach to work, especially later when we connect our programmatically created form to our HTML code, you need to import something in app module. You don't need the forms module. This is required for the template-driven approach. Instead, you need the reactive forms module. Make sure to also import it up here from @Angular forms. So reactive forms module, this is the module containing all the tools we need now to build our form on our own and then connect it to our HTML code. So back in the template, in the next video, we're going to create the actual form. So we set everything up in the last lecture. Now let's create our form. Now we could initialize it right here to set a value immediately, but I don't like to do this here. I want to have it in a method because it actually is quite a lot of code and it's not the best place to have it right here at the top in the property declaration area. So I will use the onInit lifecycle hook for this. So I will import onInit, make sure to import it from @Angular core. And therefore I'm required to implement the onInit method. And in here I will initialize my form. You should initialize it before rendering the template, of course. So make sure to use a lifecycle hook, which is called before the template is rendered. Here I will set up my sign up form and we'll set it equal to what? Well, keep in mind, sign up form is of type form group. So we need to create a new form group here, just like this. Now we have almost a valid form. We need to pass a JavaScript object here and we're theoretically done. This is our first created form. This JavaScript object configures it, and as it's empty, it simply says, or it tells Angular, hey, this form doesn't have any controls. So let's add some. Controls are basically just key value pairs in this object we pass to the overall form group. So let's have a look at our HTML code. We have a username field and an email field, and then we got the radio buttons here at the bottom. So it would make sense to have a username control. I'm wrapping this in quotation marks to make sure that during minification, when this code gets mangled, this property name is kept because I will reference it in the HTML code. This might not be necessary, it might not get destroyed, but just to be sure, I'm wrapping it as a string. So here, what is this now? Well, this is a form control, another class made available by the reactive forms module, or by this forms package here, I should say. So I will set up or create a new form control here, and form control should also be added from the forms package from @Angular forms. Now to this form control constructor, we can pass a couple of arguments. The first argument is the initial state, the initial value of this control, you could say. The second argument will be a single validator or an array of validators we want to apply to this control. I'll come back to this. The third argument will be potential asynchronous validators. I will also come back to this later. For now, I want to set an initial state of null to have an empty field. But you could also pass a string like default username, and now this would later be displayed as a default username. Again, I'll keep it at null for now. Now, have a look at the template again. The next field is the email. So I'm going to add another control, another key value pair in this JavaScript object, which will also be a new form control. And here I will also set a default value of null. Again, validation will be added later. Now, gender, this is the gender the user selects, is also a new form control. It might be a radio button, but that is just a normal input in the end. So to Angular, it simply is a control. And here I could set this to null, but I want to select a default gender. So here I will actually select male because that's my gender. Feel free to pick female, of course, or add more genders to this array of genders up here to begin with. With this, a basic form is initialized. It has 3 controls, and that is all for now. This is our first basic form. Now in the next lecture, we're going to connect this form we created here in TypeScript to our form we have set up in the HTML code.